I'm in the business of wanting to resurrect that triumphant beast in me.
Welcome to The Boundless Body, the podcast with a somatic doctor interviewing innovative thinkers about their perspectives relating to the arts and sciences of therapy. Discover The Boundless Body.
Back to the mystery.
Okay, so I'm really honored to have Susan Blackmore here at The Boundless Body. Thank you, Susan, for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. So I'm just going to read your introduction here. Susan Blackmore is a psychologist, lecturer, and writer best known for her book, The Meme Machine, as well as the textbook Consciousness: An Introduction. She's a visiting professor at the University of Plymouth in the UK, and her research interests include memes, evolutionary theory, consciousness, near-death experiences, free will, lucid dreams, sleep paralysis, which is really interesting. That shows up clinically for me. Drugs, psychedelics, spirituality, and meditation. She has written more than 60 academic papers, 100 contributions to books, and her work has been translated into 20 other languages. She has practiced Zen for 40 years and plays in a samba band.
Yeah.
That's cool. Are you a drummer?
I'm a drummer. It's very strange. I live in a little tiny village in the middle of South Devon, all green hills and little villages. And when we came here from Bristol, what is there to do in Ermington? Well, there's a knitting group and a reading group that doesn't seem to read very much, and a samba band. And we practice every week in the 13th century beautiful church, where I'm happy to say there's an engraving over the top that says, "Praise the Lord with the loud cymbals." So as an atheist, I don't feel too bad about poor God perhaps being cross with me. Yeah,
that's awesome. I like to think that there's a rhythm to consciousness itself, that there's a fundamental rhythm to consciousness. Jung was into that idea, that with his idea of the transcendent function, that there's a kind of rhythm that's in the infrastructure of things.
But when you talk about consciousness itself, that's already ringing bells in my head, because I'm always spanning the philosophy and the neuroscience and trying to understand these things. And if you say consciousness itself, it kind of implies that something separate from all the goings on in a body and brain. And I think it probably isn't. I think it probably isn't, both from a neuroscience point of view, because if you think that way, you've got the hard problem, how does it emerge in the brain, all that, but also from a spiritual practice point of view and the whole non-dual traditions, which when you have non-dual experience, it's not consciousness separate from everything else. It's everything being one. So tricky thing. Sorry, I shouldn't try and get the criticisms in too fast and tear things apart, should I?
Yeah, well, no, let's rip shit up. I really like that. As soon as Jung starts talking about the transcendent, then it immediately, for the critically oriented mind, is going to bring up ideas of the immanent, that there's nothing outside the fray, that it's all in the infrastructure. And then we could say that there's consciousness itself, which is immanent, and then there's the means that talk about consciousness, or the ways that we code consciousness, right?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So maybe you could talk about,
a lot of those memes are actually not very helpful, is the problem, and they cover up whatever it is they're trying to explain and get themselves in terrible muddles. And the whole thing about, not the whole thing, an important thing about memes is the ones that we pick up and the ones that we share are not necessarily the ones that are most helpful or closer to the truth. People love dualist ideas. They love the idea that consciousness is something additional to what they are physically, that it can survive death, that it has powers. Those ideas are very popular. And the kind of non-dual ideas are not nearly so popular, much harder to get across. And this is memes doing their stuff. Memes are just selfish information trying to use our brains to get themselves copied. And on the whole, as a human race, we tend to copy things that aren't necessarily the best that we could.
The Meme Machine. This is your book. This is your magnum opus. Would you consider it your magnum opus, or?
Well, magnum means big, and the magnum in that sense is the
Okay.
is the consciousness textbook. My daughter and I have just finished the 4th edition of the consciousness textbook. It's called Consciousness and Introduction, which is what you always call the first textbook in any field, and it is the only textbook in the field of consciousness studies. A textbook as in for students, it's full of exercises and, lots of illustrations and boxes and all kinds of stuff for students to work with. It's 600 pages, 2,000 references. It's been a trial, but it came out last month, and we're happy and relaxing. But if you ask about the Meme Machine, it's the only book of mine. I've written, 13, 14 books published. It's the only book of mine that I would say paid enough money to pay for the time it took to write. Most of my books, you struggle away writing for ages and ages. You can't do that for the money. So in that sense, the Meme Machine has been really popular. It's cited loads and loads of times in the academic world where citations count. Is it my magnum opus? Well, I don't know. But I'm pleased that people go on reading it, because it's pretty old now, but they do. Because they want to find out. We are meme machines. This is the point. As far as I'm concerned, Richard Dawkins coined the term meme as another replicator. So genes are selfish information trying to get themselves copied by our bodies and animals and plants' bodies. And that's how biology works. And his idea was that in culture, when we copy information from person to person and we vary it a bit, and then some copies do better than others, it's another evolutionary process, just like biology. And memes are the replicator. They're at the heart of it. So we humans are the meme machines. We pick up memes from other people. We then forget them, throw them away, or we get obsessed with them and pass them on to everybody we know, or we change them a bit, and, some of the versions that we make do better than others. And that's how culture evolves. That's the idea. And some people really hate the idea that we're just meme machines. That's who I am. I'm a mixture of all the memes that have kind of infected this body all my life, It's kind of uncomfortable, and that's a mimetic effect as well. However, I'm glad people read it. All those meme machines out there reading the book.
For individuals or couples interested in therapy or counseling, you can sign up for a free consultation or our newsletter for more information on integrative therapeutic modalities.
So there's a few concepts there. There's the concept of meme machine. There's replication. There's copying. And then there's memetic. All of these are like big topics. Maybe we could focus on, or we could talk a little bit about the identity complex. Because identity, in a way, is a type of code. It's a type of meme. Would you agree?
Yeah, or Memeplex, a whole collection of memes that work together. So the same as in biology, you have a co-adapted gene complex where certain genes work together and make up an organism in the way it is. And the same with memes. Some memes separate things, like certain internet memes, but a personality, an identity is built up of all these memes that kind of work together, and sometimes they don't, and that's very uncomfortable. But that's the idea. They kind of make up a meme organism, if you like.
A meme organism, a memeplex. And I did review this discussion that you had with Jordan Peterson about archetypes and memes, which I thought was quite interesting. And then I reviewed some of your literature, some of your text, and did encounter memeplex as a term applied to religion. That religion is a meta code, as it were. A memeplex, like a gigantic identity generating obelisk. What? A memeplex?
Yep. Think about what a religion is. I've been thinking about this a lot because I've long been an atheist, but I know quite a lot about religion. It fascinates me. And I was brought up a Christian, baptized, and all that stuff. Now, religions, particularly the God religions, the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, God is a really nasty thing. You're supposed to fear him as well as love him. He's supposed to have made us and know everything that we do. And then he has power over us with threats and promises. It's the most childish meme trick you can imagine. So imagine a whole complex of memes in Christianity say, you've got the virgin birth and Jesus and all the wonderful things that he did and miracles and all of that. And this is backed up. You've got to believe this and say the creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, all that. Because if you do, then you'll go to heaven and that'll be wonderful forever. And if you don't, and if you're naughty and don't obey all those rules that are there in the Bible, and some of them really awful, and if you don't, well, then you're going to burn in hell forever. And there are wonderful pictures of, being spiked with burning things and sulfur and God knows what to frighten people. So the structure of a God memeplex is very unpleasant and very sticky and been around for 2,000 years because people are frightened of going to hell and they like the idea of heaven. They don't, on the whole, back to what I was saying about memes, they don't pick the truth, which is we evolved here for no good reason. We just are here, in my opinion. There's no great purpose to it. They prefer the idea that God gave us a purpose and we can explain everything that way. And they're frightened and tempted by heaven. So on and on and on. And you're told to pass it on to your children and have lots of children and pass it on to them all. And so the memeplex keeps going for 2,000 years. Gosh, just saying that makes me feel upset about the power.
Yeah. And then it spits out code, duplication code to be cloned. The whole element here at play is a cloning mechanism. Yeah.
Yes. Well, yeah.
It's interesting because the immune system in the body uses this clonal selection element. So that biology and organisms use cloning quite a bit as well. So there's something memifying about,
These analogies between biology and memetics are very often quite close. It's not the same because in biology, it's all done by replicating bits of chemistry. And in culture, it's done by replicating words and stories and songs and ways of doing things and all of that. But the underlying process is the way the stuff and the competitions between different stuff to get replicated. And this gets replicated and this doesn't for various different reasons, good and bad. So yeah, there's a lot of similarities there.
So there was a threshold that our ancestors crossed called the language acquisition threshold, and hard to say whether it was like a sudden leap or if it was a gradual thing or kind of both, or if it involved mutation. But at some point there was language symbolic acquisition and language structures were built and then coded and replicated. Yeah. So I'm curious about, what you've thought over time about linguistics, the origin of language, and how that relates to the early memeplex, the earliest, what could we think about it, the earliest memeplex?
Right. Well, I've thought a lot about this. And of course, there is some archaeology and so on to help us along in anthropology, but we don't really know the answers. But the critical thing to me is the takeoff, because we humans are quite different from any other animal. Yeah, there are other animals that have all kinds of communication, things like little hints of symbolic language, perhaps in whales and porpoises and elephants, maybe. But we have these really big things. And I think those two things are closely connected. So as guesswork, probably the first memes, certainly the first memes could only happen when early humans began to be able to imitate each other. Because the whole point about evolution is you need some kind of information. It's got to be copied. It's got to be copied with variations. So there's something for selection to work on. And then most of the variations die out, the selection and the ones that survive. So in biology, what's copied is genes. But in culture, what's copied is memes. So you need imitation some kind of imitation, some kind of copying of behaviors. Now, most animals can't do that. They really can't. There are some little hints of copying here and there. There's not much good at it. So culture doesn't take off in other species in the way it has in humans. So imagine that maybe lighting a fire and keeping it going would be a really useful thing to be able to do. And we're talking perhaps 2 million years ago, but we don't really know. Now, if somebody else could walk and copy how that's done and then do it yourself, you would be in a better position to get a good mate, to have lots of kids, because you could probably feed them more food and all that kind of thing. So you would pass on to your offspring any genes that had helped you to be a good imitator. It might be true also if you just imitated things like, I don't know, wearing clothes or putting feathers in your hair, or I don't know, or making marks on your body and things like that get copied. And it might be been very trendy to mark yourself with red clay or whatever. And then again, you'd get a better mate because you were the trendy one who managed to copy that skill. Now, the point about this is then language would come about. Like most animals, we probably had signs making noises for things, but it's only once you are able to point at something and go fire or rock or tool, axe or whatever it might be, or food, and have sounds. And to do that, you need imitation to copy the other copy. These skills, imitation, take a lot of brain power. It's not trivial. If you think about what it means to copy, let's say I'm going to copy you. Will you do something, please? Excellent. Well, here's a new meme. Everybody out there, do it. Now, and I'm not doing it exactly like you, but I hope I'm getting the rough. But the point is to think about how the brain, what it's got to do. We've got to watch you, see what you did, see your hands do that, and then transfer that into my body and my hands so that it would look the same on the screen where we can see both of us, and that it would look the same. That is computationally quite demanding. So the people with the slightly bigger brains that could do this would then pass on to the children slightly bigger brains. And then that's my argument, and there are similar arguments in biology now. That's what drove the big brain. Now, where my argument differs from more standard views in evolution theory is that I think that language was not necessarily a terribly good idea. I mean, in the sense that it made our brains get bigger and bigger, to the point where they're so big they can only just get out of a female hip, because any mother like myself will know, human birth is a bit more painful than, that of other animals, so they just slip out nicely, because we have such big brains. And we've gone on elaborating a language which causes us to have all sorts of troubles and worries and so on. And yes, it was biologically useful in some senses, but I think it's kind of run away with itself. It's been runaway mimetic evolution that has caused the big brains and the absolute explosion of rather a long answer to your question, but it was a very interesting question.
It's music to my ears, Susan. In my dissertation, I delved quite deeply into the work of René Girard, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with. He wrote this book called Violence and the Sacred, and he talks a lot about mimetic desire.
And I have not read that book. I know a little bit about his work, but I've not read the book, and perhaps I should.
Well, so he's basically orbiting around mimetic desire, around imitation, that imitation can be one of the roots of violence, a significant root of violence, where somebody has something that I don't have and I want to imitate it, but for example, I don't have the resources, or I can't do it. So, I mean, this would be a deep case for the psychodynamics of envy, which, I teach at CIIS, at California Institute of Integral Studies. Have you ever played there at all or taught there?
In my far off days as a parapsychologist, I knew people who worked there in the early days of the institute. Yeah.
Yeah, so I like to do an informal poll of graduate level psychology students about how much they've talked about envy, the psychodynamics of envy. And that informal poll has essentially yielded less than 1%. Less than 1% of graduate level psychology students have had an ongoing discussion about envy. Now, I personally think envy is radically important. There's very ancient memes about envy in fairy tales and in mythologies, and it shows up a lot. And there's been a lot of psychologists that have dedicated a lot of time to talking about envy. But what Girard did is he created this link between mimesis, imitation, and envy. He didn't necessarily call it envy, though he occasionally did. But the desire to imitate isn't just, let's just replicate and have a good time. If your code is different or something like that, or I want to imitate it and I can't, I don't have the capacity or something like that, it can create some pretty nasty things.
And if you think about mimetic evolution, which is all the evolution of everything that we've got, the imitation would have started off with pretty simple things. I mean, if you took the example of making fire, you're not really harming the person who's first made the fire because you're going to make your own fire. You might be envious of their twigs or logs or whatever they've got to burn, but nowadays, there is so much more to be envious of. And all the things that people want, all the trendy clothes and all the whatever. That's a massive pressure that has got worse and worse. Again, I'm saying that, mimetic evolution is not entirely a good thing for human happiness or human thriving, because there's so much else we can be envious of, which is awful. Biologically, of course, you can be envious of somebody else's mate, and there's always that problem of wanting to steal other people's women when you think of women as owned, which is the kind of biological basis that we started from, unfortunately. But now there's a billion things to be envious of. So it's pretty tough being a human now, given that you start off with a bit of envy in you.
Robin Dunbar has one theory of language acquisition. I don't know if you've heard of Dunbar's number. Have you heard of this?
Absolutely. I know Robin Dunbar, yeah.
Oh, you do? He's in your neck of the woods, yeah?
Yeah, that's right.
I really think his theory is quite elegant around, like, there was a ceiling of group members, about 150, and that we met with various glass ceilings in evolution, that things like song and grooming allowed us to expand and crack through that group limit. And
the group limit, remember the group limit. If you think of other apes and monkeys, the way they kept the groups together is by grooming each other. Now, how many people can you groom? Your body stuff. Now, how many people can you groom at once? Not very many. And certainly if you had maybe 20 people, and if you lived together in a sort of communal thing, you could all groom each other a bit, couldn't you? You might, you could get the numbers up a bit. But what Dunbar's point was that those things, as you pointed out, language and song and so on, enabled us to do the equivalent, keeping contact with, reassuring, helping, arguing with, whatever, without the physical touching. And then you can increase the numbers. But there comes a point which depends on how many people we can remember, how many you can actively talk to, and so on. And he set that at 150 because he discovered that, this, so that's why you brought up Dunbar, but he found it like through the army, the sizes of groups, and through business, very often the groups and businesses split when they get to that size. And there's a lot of evidence that was a really brilliant idea of his.
Yeah, I think it's quite brilliant, and then in one of his articles, he wrote the phrase, singing is grooming at a distance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's brilliant. That's brilliant input tonight. Now, can I tell you a story about Robin Dunbar? Because I've met him a few times, but the most recent time, my daughter does all kinds of fascinating things. But one of the things she occasionally does is to run failure sessions and gets people together to talk about failure. Because actually, a lot of people have discovered in their life that it's the things that you fail at that are actually important. If you fail at everything, it's a disaster, but a mixture of success and failure can be important. And she invited various students. This was in Oxford, where she was working at the university. There were mostly graduate students, postgrads, and there was myself and my husband, who was a TV presenter, and Robin Dunbar, and I'm sorry, I forget who the fourth person was, but we were talking, and we were talking about failure. And I always thought of Robin as like, wow, so amazingly successful, and Dunbar's number, and it's amazing. And he told about his life, how he hadn't at all become famous. He hadn't done an ordinary route of being brilliant at everything. And, he'd done all sorts of things. And then eventually, quite, late in his life, fallen into all this biology and done these brilliant things. And the failures that he'd gone through earlier were actually very important to then becoming who he was and doing those brilliant things. I still remember that. It's probably 10 years ago now, but that session about failure was really important to me, and possibly, I think, probably to him as well.
So cool. I just got the third tingle response, goosebump response, in the last about 3.5 minutes since we've been talking about Robin. I've had the goosebump response three times. Now, I'm really, really interested in the tingle response. This is another domain where I've been doing informal research for about 15 years. I'm really interested in the moment that I feel a tingle response and other people feel it. And I've run into really interesting research articles about the goosebump response. So do you know what I'm talking about? Do you have a relationship with the tingle response and the goosebump response that you can talk about? Or?
Not really. I mean, if I think of responses that kind of catch me unawares, there tends to be a kind of sort of clutching at the heart response. Goosebump response, yeah, but it's very rare. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about, but I would say it's very rare for me. I'll watch out for it, but that's not much use to you. But no, I can't very much with that one, I'm afraid. But it's not something I'm kind of really familiar with.
Well, so the research on it is that some people feel it more than others, and the subjective experience is almost always equated with states of awe, and like in nature scenes, for example. But it often happens in relationship with music and the arts.
Well, I've got two thoughts on that. One, I really don't want to listen to music. I know this is weird. I have no music in my house, no music in my phone, no music in my car, no music in my computer, because I don't want music around. And the reason is, when I hear music, like the other day I was listening to Desert Island Discs on Radio 4. It's a wonderful program where it's been going 50 years, and where a famous person has to choose their favorite 8 discs, because it was invented when it was all, vinyl, if they were stranded on a desert island, what they'd want. So of course the music comes on, and this is typical of me. I was cleaning my teeth in the bathroom, and something came on. I don't remember what it was, some kind of classical music I'm very familiar with, and I just was the emotion just poured over me. I don't know about any tingling, it was just like, and I just like, I could not actually weeping, but I could feel wet in my eyes. And that's okay. I was in the bathroom, but I'm so quickly overwhelmed with or moving music that I just don't want any around. And I can't understand how people can read a book while music's in the background. I'd be just like completely, So
it's really powerful for you. Music is just it brings up these big waves of emotion. It's going to be hard to drive. So don't put on that classical music while you're driving.
Oh yeah. Once I was driving a hire car in Scotland from some conference or something, and I turned on the radio I don't know why, but anyway I did. And on came Pachelbel's famous piece from the centuries ago, and I thought, I'm going to crash. I really had to that's quickly, I was torn between wanting to hear it because it's a beautiful piece of music, and trying to, not crash and press the radio to turn it off. And I was shaking. So yeah, it's too much for me. Now, you could say that if I wanted to be a normal person and then could go to a restaurant and cope with eating a meal while there's music in the background, which that's why very rarely go to rest because I can't cope with it. I should kind of do what do you call it? I'm supposed to be a psychologist. Just flood me with lots of music until I get used to it, until it stops having that reaction, like you would with spiders, and gradually show people. Yeah, gradually show me a little bit of music and then build it up until I can cope with it. But that'd be a shame, wouldn't it?
I can connect with that, Susan. I have some auditory sensitivities where sometimes I'll go into an environment and I'll just feel like the cacophony just gets inside my nervous system in a way that I just can't, I just shut down. I got to get out of there. It's just, I can't compute.
Oh, great. Then you understand, because a lot of people don't understand at all. So you do, even if it's not a big part of your life, you can understand it. But the other thing you mentioned was the sense of awe. Now, I get that a lot, not just from, like, I live out there, I could see the river, I live on the side of a river, and just sometimes, or when I walked home this evening, just the glinting of the water on there stopped me for a moment, and I was like, and it's a kind of opening out response. And it's similar to in meditation, where I'm not inside here at all. It's all this. And that has a similar feeling, which involves relief, openness, connection. All these things are ineffable. I mean, you can't really describe it, but that may be the sort of thing that you're talking about, that people often have when they stand in awe of something, or they're really shocked suddenly by their own response to.
Yeah,
it's like you stop, kind of.
Yeah, and
you
you did it twice. It takes your breath away. You actually did this primordial gesture. That's there in the idiom. It's there in the meme. It took my breath away, and you did it. And I ran into this really. Well, yeah, there's different ways of having our breath being taken away, right? So I ran into this really interesting literature about chimpanzees, and they're positing in the article that chimpanzees have a kind of neighboring feeling of awe, and it shows up in two ways. One is around waterfalls. So one of the things, so when chimpanzees get around waterfalls, it's not all the time, it's only when there's a group of them, they will start to do these very peculiar rooting sounds. And it's very clear that they're in relationship with the sounds of the waterfall, and there's these gestural configurations that the chimpanzees do in kind of a unison. And what they've found, actually, and this is my tingle research thing, is that the chimpanzees are almost always tingling. Their goosebump response is elicited as a group.
What people have actually measured on their skin, have they, to find this out?
Yeah, galvanic skin response.
Yeah.
And so they're like,
skin response doesn't measure the goosebumps, it measures the sweat, but I guess that's pretty
true.
related.
So however they measured it, it was like above 90% of the chimpanzees had the goosebump response. So that is incredible. And I'm just thinking about this ancient, like how old this could be. And then the other environment is that there's this strange, what to call it, ritual, where chimpanzees throw rocks at a tree, and they don't just do it randomly. There's whole piles of rocks in very specific trees. It's not any random tree. It's like a very specific tree, and then they keep throwing rocks at the tree over generations.
And it's one of those imitation things which are a prelude in evolution to us getting too good at it for our own good, if you like. And they are then copying that the other ones are using the same tree and those rocks, the particular rocks, and so it spreads, becomes a cultural item. And this is one of in chimpanzees, there are different groups that have different cultures that have evolved, but they never seem to kind of take off like it has with humans. They'll stay doing that thing with a tree for generations after generations, but it never then, oh, well, let's do different trees, or let's build our own trees, or let's pile the rocks in it might be that they don't take off in the same way. That imitation isn't high fidelity enough to come to language and all the memes that we have. But that's a very interesting one. But I'm not entirely convinced, but I'm convinced by that evidence that it's a very interesting phenomenon, but I'm not so sure that it's very closely related to the goosebump response that we were talking about in terms of awe, a human response to something like amazing. I don't know. Lots more to be found out, obviously.
It's a fledgling theory of mine that I'm hammering out in my book right now, and kind of coupled with my informal research and when students in the classroom, in the here and now, get the tingle response, I ask them to share with me, when it's happening, and I kind of see how many people, and I kind of gauge my own response, my own subjective response in terms of the intensity of my own tingle response. And so it's an ongoing interest of mine.
What are the most common things that they say when you ask them about that create this response?
Well, and this is where the complexity comes up about memes, because everybody seems to have their different language about it.
Yeah.
So
it's not,
you know what I mean?
Like in polite situations, is it? It's sort of a little bit weird to most people. So we don't develop a common language to talk about it easily.
So there's at least I'm positing that there's a collective experience of some kind. There's a bottom-up process. There's a sensory process. There's tingles. Okay. We all share it probably on some level, whether it's good, the bad, or the ugly. And then there's the coding structure that each student brings to it. So some will say, I felt like, for example, if they have a Christian upbringing, they'd say, oh, it's the Holy Spirit or something. Yeah. Or if they had, kind of a yogic background or something like that, they might say Kundalini.
Kundalini.
Yeah. Or, whatever meme it is, it then codes the experience. And I'm really interested in the bottom up process. And I'd rather just keep it scientific at the moment and just call it involuntary piloerection, because that's what science calls it, right? But it does seem to converge on what the psychological literature has in the research base. At least they've equated the tingle response. Not all tingle responses. We can get it when we're creeped out by people and stuff too. Yeah. But that the ones that are elicited by kind of music or nature is almost always equated with states of awe and quote unquote transcendence. But then all these different coding structures come in to kind of code it and memify it. And that's, to me, what,
And that has good and bad aspects to it. The good aspect is it allows you to talk to somebody else. You've got a word to talk to them with. And the bad thing is it's kind of putting it in a box and making people feel that they have to fit that box. And that's very tricky to do when you're talking about potentially mystical experiences or profound experiences of various kinds. Putting names on them can kind of destructive of an ineffable experience.
Yeah. Old teacher of mine once said, once you name the ineffable, then you have a holy war.
Yep. Yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
We're back to the power of religion, yes. Because somebody names it this, somebody else names it that, and then they get to argue about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Instead of finding ways to enable such experiences if they have value.
Susan, could you talk to us a little bit about memes and archetypes and how you could distinguish, how they're different, how they might have some similarities?
Not really. I mean, you mentioned Jordan Peterson, and he brought up this. And, I'm no expert on archetypes and Jung and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I read loads of Jung when I was young, but it doesn't really fit with the modern neuroscience and what we know about the brain and so on. Mm-hmm. Archetypes, I think, are quite useful names for familiar things, but it doesn't do anything much for me. Mm-hmm. And Jordan Peterson was just it was so weird, that interview I did with him. He was just constantly trying to trap me into things. It was
so fast paced. It was just like, whoa.
Well, I don't mind that, but he was contradicting himself, and he said, "Oh, well, look, that just means." Well, of course, in a sense, an archetype being a word and passed on idea, it is a meme, but I don't think it really helps very much to think about it at memes. But maybe you can make me try. I mean, I would try and say by recognizing these archetypes in the sense of certain kinds of humans or certain kinds of human behaviors, then we pass on those words, and those words are memes. But I can't go much further than that. I don't think memetics helps us. And I don't really think that the theory archetype helps very much. But other people do think it does. So I'll leave it to them, I'm afraid.
Well, let's see if we can, maybe I can offer an example that we can just kind of noodle around. So there's nurturance systems in the mammal, like the attachment biology, where you have the opioids and the oxytocins. You have nurturance giving and nurturance receiving, and that's driven by biological potencies. And, so that's like a system. It's a biological system. And it has a lot to do with love and attachment. And it's, it has it's a neighbor to what Jaak Panksepp calls the lust system. There's kind of similar biological elements that converge and diverge a bit. So those two systems, at least from my perspective, converge on an archetypal image that keeps on showing up in cross-cultural stories, fairy tales, the shape of stories cross-culturally as the image of the lovers, as the image of the lover, and those lover stories are timeless. They show up in, like I lived in New Zealand for a little bit, and, locally there's a waterfall, and that waterfall has a story. It has a story about lovers that, there's this tragic loss that happened. And as a result of the tragic loss that happened, that's how the waterfall came into being.
Yeah, there's loads of stories like that around the world. Absolutely. It doesn't do anything for me somehow. I don't know. But when you were speaking, I thought about tarot cards. That's one of the cards. Back in my days in parapsychology, when I believed in all kinds of stuff, I became a fairly proficient, not brilliant, but a fairly proficient tarot reader. And those archetypes are all there in the cards. And of course, when I started out, I believed that there was something magical in the cards, but I did the experiments. Being a scientist, I did experiments and showed that actually you need to be there with the person, and that what's happening is reading body language and asking questions and seeing the responses and all of that. But of course, what the cards do is they lay out what you might call archetypes, and then you're just responding to those because they're all fundamental things that happen in human lives.
There's still seems to be a clustering of story types, like that cluster around the theme of the lover, and love's forged and love's lost and things like that.
Well, it's not surprising, given we're biological organisms that need to have sex and make babies. I mean, we did need to. We don't need to now, but it's not surprising, is it? I think that's kind of what I feel about all of this stuff. It's not very surprising, and it doesn't terribly.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not very surprising. It's not very magical from the sense of, well, yeah, I mean, we have that in our wiring to attach, and we have the lusty bits that, make us copulate and stuff like that. And then we tell all these complex stories, and then we fight about the stories.
Yeah, right.
So I guess what I'm thinking, and maybe this is a bridge, maybe not, but I do think that there's some, there's a connective between the concept of Memeplex, as you've been unpacking it, and archetype, where it seems to be a big kind of like magnet to the iron filings of people and experience, and then it gathers structure over time, and then you have a whole system,
you're absolutely right. I mean, you're doing a better job than I can do. You've answered the question better than I can do, because I haven't really thought about it in that way. But you're right. These ideas, which are so fundamental to the kind of creatures we are, accrete these other memes and become memeplexes that then get passed on. They don't have the horrific power of the religions, and That's perhaps why I haven't sort of studied them in the same depth.
I think the religions have absorbed the memeplexes of the archetypes and made a mega memeplex, like a mega memeplex.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned your parapsychology journey, and I just reviewed this text that quoted you. His name is George Hansen, The Trickster and the Paranormal.
Long time ago. Yeah.
Okay. So anyways,
40 years.
Extraordinary. What's cool about the book is he's not a joiner. He's not like, he's got a great critical mind, and he cites you as one of the people that's been, open enough to go in and say, okay, let's check it out. Let's see it. Paranormal. Let's check it out. Let's, an open mind that doesn't just block it out. Let's go in and check it out. Let's research. Let's see what's happening. Let's get into plumbing. But then, so you went fully into it, and then you ended up bringing a critical mind to the whole process itself. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that journey.
Well, it was a long journey. In a way, it's still continuing. I expect some people listening would know about this and be bored to death because I've talked about it an awful lot, but some maybe not. If we go back now to 1970, that's sort of 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago. And as a young student of 19, my first term at Oxford, I had a very, very dramatic out-of-body come mystical experience. And it really has been, it's driven my entire life, the curiosity of my entire life in a way. Because what happened was, I was sitting around listening to music with some friends late at night, terribly tired, enjoying getting up early for lectures and staying up too late at night. Smoked a little bit of a joint, but I was feeling quite sort of, and I started going down a tunnel towards the light. We didn't know about near-death experiences in those days. I'd never heard of such things. So I'm going down this tunnel. And then I was with two friends, and one of them said, where are you, Sue? Which is a very strange question because I'm sat there on the floor right in front of him. I was like, where am I? Oh, God, I'm in Vicky's room, and where am I? And it was as though I was on the ceiling looking down, and I could see me and the two friends in this room. And it all looked completely realistic to begin with. And I said, I'm on the ceiling. And I could see my own mouth opening and shutting and saying, I'm on the ceiling. And this friend of mine, Kevin, because he was really into the occult, which is why, he was my boyfriend at the time. And we ran the Psychic Society together. He was really into astral projection and all that kind of stuff. So he was really excited. He said, oh, wow, you're in your astral body. Oh, and what can you see? And he just kept talking to me. I would imagine, given everything I now know about out-of-body experiences, that if he hadn't been doing that, I would have become frightened and would have ended the experience. And it would be like the length of time of OBEs is about 30 seconds to a minute. I mean, really short, because your body and your brain are always trying to get you back to the viewpoint from inside your eyes looking at. Anyway, so I went off on my travels. The whole thing lasted nearly 3 hours and transformed from being a classic kind of astral projection thing of floating around as another body, then becoming, changing shape and so on, and then becoming very small, then becoming very large. And ultimately, I'm cutting this down to, obviously the bare bones of a mystical experience of oneness. I mean, I am everything and nothing. There's no distinction, everything, and nothing's happening. Space and time are not there. That kind of things happen, and there is something, but it's not. These are these. So you can imagine that I'm going, how can I understand that? There I am doing, 1970, we're talking, the kind of psychology and physiology I was learning in my degree was, chopping up rats' brains and running rats through mazes and, that sort of stuff. Didn't have any relationship to spiritual experiences of any kind. I got in some trouble with my tutors for being obsessed with all these kind of weird things. And that's when I became a tarot reader and used my crystal ball and all these kind of things that I learned, because I thought that the only way to explain this amazing experience would be some kind of paranormal phenomena. I thought, there is a Akashic records, there is another world, there's a world of consciousness, it's not the same as the brain. I went into a classic dualist feeling about the nature of consciousness, which dualism really doesn't work. But anyway, I did. And I was sure that there was telepathy and I mean, I just got to believe in everything: telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, precognition, the four phenomena in studied in parapsychology, ghosts, poltergeists, all these kind of crying, and all these kind of things for years and years and years. And I found a way, got a job, and funded myself through a PhD in parapsychology, which is very, very rare in those days. I was certainly the first woman ever to have done one in Britain. And the more research I did, the more I discovered that there ain't no phenomena. I mean, there could be. If anyone really finds evidence that there are any paranormal phenomena, I would go back into parapsychology, but there isn't. You can read endless books that will convince you that good scientists have found a little bit of telepathy or something or other, or that, somebody's left their body and seen something at a distance that they couldn't know about. And every time you really investigate in detail, you find that those stories don't hold up. Now, if it were true, all our science, most of our science would have to be transformed, which might be a good thing. I don't know, but it certainly would be really, really important if it were true. Yeah. And I concluded after all those years that it wasn't true. And finally, around 25 years ago, maybe, I thought, I do not want to spend any more time on this. And I'm really glad there are lots of people out there still doing parapsychology, still investigating these things, because if it were true, it would be important. But I don't want to do it anymore. And since then, I've been trying to understand the innate consciousness without recourse to magical theories, to try and understand it naturalistically. And through, as we mentioned earlier, I've been practicing Zen I'm not a Buddhist. I won't sign up to any religion, as you can imagine from what I've said. And I'm lucky enough to mostly like me, just ordinary atheists interested in spirituality. And I go on retreats and I meditate every day. And so these things are much, much more productive, interesting, worthwhile than those early beliefs that I had, which are hardly abandoned now.
If we could reduce the argument against paranormal activity, it often converges on the issue of replication. Like okay, so something happened and let's try to replicate it. Nope, can't. Something happened, let's try to replicate it. Nope, can't. Right? Is that a good way of reducing it? It's like replication is one like major argument that it just can't be reproduced. Or if it can be reproduced, but as a kind of collective mean field, or what the Russians call the egregore, like a collective mind just kind of makes it happen or something.
It's, as you know, it's critical in science to be able to reproduce some effect, to replicate experiments and so on. Yeah. And to some extent, that makes it very difficult within parapsychology, because people can always say, they used to say that, oh, Sue Blackmore's a psi-inhibitory experimenter. She just comes anywhere near an experiment and it won't. And it works for us, but not when she's around. Can't test that theory really, because well, you can do experiments with me there and not, and but all sorts of other reasons, because they're fiddling at something, or any number of things. Oh, here, my delightful husband has come to bring me some more wine. It is 7:00 in the evening, so if people are watching this and think I'm drinking in the morning, I am really not. Very much. No, I didn't. Thank you very much. Very welcome. You've got a little kid there.
Oh, you hear her? Yeah, she's 4.
Lovely. What a lovely age. Hello, Freya. Yeah. I love little girls who are 4 years old. I've got a granddaughter who's 6. Very grown up. Yeah. So, back to replicable experiments. There's a very good case to be put, not for psi-inhibitory experimenters, but for the fact that a lot of paranormal claims we simply can't reproduce. If somebody has an out-of-body experience during near death, and they claim to see something at a distance, somebody's wearing a green dress down the corridor or a shoe on a ledge, whatever it might be, we can't reproduce that, obviously. But there are things we can do. So when I became obsessed with testing claims of out-of-body experiences, I tried to do it lab experiments, but you can't. I mean, I can't get someone in the lab and go, right, go out of your body now. It's not going to work. There are a few people who can do that. They can have an out-of-body experience at will. And there have been experiments with very controversial, I kept claiming it. But what in the case of ours was whenever I met somebody who claimed to have OBEs, I said, well, can you come to my house? It actually started with a guy who said he had OBEs very frequently at night. And he came to visit me he said, okay, when I next have an out-of-body experience, I will come to your house. So I know where it is now. I've seen the house and I want to put somewhere that I can't see something for me to prove that I've been there. So what I did it for several years anyway. I put behind a fridge, or sort of to the side of the fridge, where if you look through the front windows of the kitchen, you couldn't possibly see it. So, somebody'd have to break into the house to see it. But if they came in their astral body, they should be able to come through the walls and see the thing. And I got a 5-digit number that I changed every week, but, randomly. And a little object. I had a box with 20 little things in, a toothbrush and a toy dog and I don't know, whatever. And I'd randomize it and put a different one up each week. And a word. I had 20 words. And again, I'd pick one of them randomly and stick them on the wall. And over the years, I met other people and I told them about this and said, well, if you think you can do this, and not lots, but, quite a few people said, yeah, I can do that. And very few managed to say they'd seen anything. And I think 3 who said they'd come there and saw things, they didn't see what was there. They said something completely different. So that is trying to get a naturalistic kind of experiment rather than forcing something in the lab. It is difficult. The whole question of replication in paranormal claims is very difficult. You just go on and find the experiments, sadly, where people have cheated and you sort out, or just much more often, cheating's rare but important. Much more often people who have got their statistics wrong and done the experiments in ways that allow for sensory information to pass. I got fed up with it in the end because it's so depressing when you work really, really, really hard to find out what really happened. And then you find, oh, yes, okay, that wasn't paranormal. That was my experience over all those years.
And they can be such sellable memes, right? Where somebody, right? Somebody, it's like, okay, I have now the identity as a psychic or as a demonic or medium or something like that. And when I was in psychotherapy with somebody years ago, my client said, hey, I just met this medium, and the medium said that he could get rid of the demon that has a hold of my lover who's making him do infidelity. And he's charging me $5,000 for it.
Yeah, it happens.
And it's like, what is a psychotherapist to do in the face of this meme machine, right? Like, okay, hey, there it is. I kind of leaned in a little bit and said, well, I hope I see you next week, where we can talk about this more, and we can talk about what's coming up for you, and we can talk about your desire to spend the money that you don't have.
Yep.
But in the end, she ended up going to see him.
Oh, no. This sort of thing really depressed me. It was another reason that I got out of that whole field. It was all just too depressing. You're absolutely right. And it's very interesting for me to bring this back to memetics, because I haven't really thought a lot of these things through, but it is that kind of effect. The powerful Memeplex the fact that the things people want to believe, they will believe even when they're not true. And it's very, very hard fighting against people's longing to believe that they would feel if their lover was in trouble, or they would know when somebody needed them. Sure that they will survive after death, even though everything we know about the human body and brain is it's here and now, mate. when the body's gone, that's it. It's hard.
I'm thinking now about the placebo and the nocebo effect, how powerful the mind is to project its memes into objects, its meaning into objects, and then just make reality fit to, it's complex. The placebo is like often just seen as something to cut out of a scientific experiment. But there's something there's something that's happening there, right? I mean, what do you think? Have you thought about how this all connects with the placebo and the nocebo?
Well, I think actually it's simpler than it sometimes appears. I mean, let's suppose that you get headaches and you take aspirin or paracetamol or whatever it might be that you take for your headaches, and you do that and it takes the headache away, and you get that lovely kind of relaxation response after 20 minutes or whatever it is that it takes to work, and that happens reliably. And then one day somebody sneaks a pill that looks exactly the same but isn't, and your body is just used to it's going to be okay, and relaxes and so on, and it will wear off. The placebo effect won't go on forever. Now, there are some fascinating things about placebo effects. The fact that if it's a doctor in a white coat who gives you the pill rather than your neighbor in a dirty anorak or whatever it might be, it will work better. But the nocebo effect is the opposite. You've had something that causes you pain. I mean, I have got two nocebo effects of great power. One is the dentist. Now, because I'm old, when I was a kid, when you went to the dentist, they would drill and drill with slow drills, and they'd be grinding away your teeth. They had no anesthetics. It was absolutely horrendous. And in those days, they would say, "Oh, you've got to get rid of every scrap of the rotten tooth." So they drill more and more and more. Nowadays, they go, "It doesn't matter if there's a bit left. We'll just put some antibiotic in and stick the brilliant filling in." But the pain was awful, and I can't stand. When I go to the dentist, there's one thing they do with a sucky thing in your mouth, and I just say, please don't do that. It just reminds me too much. The other thing is dogs. I was not exactly attacked, but our Alsatian next door when I was a kid used to leap through the hedge and knock us over as kids. I mean, literally jump on us and knock over. And I look at a dog and I go, I know. Now those are kind of nocebo effects and they don't wear off very quickly because you go on reacting every time you go to the dentist. It sort of wears off a bit. And I try to train myself to go and stroke dogs, but I find it extremely hard. However nice the dog is, it's still, to me, it's biology. It's very basic. An interesting theory about placebo effects that actually is quite worrying in a way. This is Nick Humphrey. He's a well-known philosopher, psychologist, that we've always got some capacity to cope with it. And under those circumstances, and I'm interested in this because of my own chronic fatigue, if you kept a bit in reserve biologically, because you need to keep a bit of strength in reserve, you're not using all your immune system all the time, you'd be exhausting it. So you've always got some in reserve. If you give placebo effect, then it can force you to use energy that actually you really best not to. You actually need to lie down and rest. I mean, again, I'm relating this to the chronic fatigue when I know full well, if I push myself beyond a certain point, I'm really, really going to pay for it. And therefore, people who don't understand about chronic fatigue will say things like, "Oh, well, you need some cocaine or just a cup of tea with lots of caffeine in it." No, I don't actually, because that will cause this body to use energy that it really hasn't got. No, thank you. What I need is to lie down. So I find all these things really fascinating, and it's great that there's so much research on placebo effects, and we're beginning to understand it now. But I'm no expert on it at all.
One of the pieces that I read was very interesting, that sham fake surgeries basically work in a high percentage of cases, right? You have somebody in the white coat coming in saying, this procedure is going to make you better, and it's a sham surgery. They do nothing basically. And voila.
Look, I'm in my old, parapsychology days, I was quite involved with, but knowledgeable about, or there was a whole craze of the Brazilian surgeons who would do, they would rummage around.
John of God.
All of that. James Randi, the magician who was the great skeptic, who's dead now, but I knew him very well, and he investigated some of these psychic surgeons. And the placebo effect was quite important there. I mean, they would rummage around it, take, my arm, they go, and they kind of, and I pull out the magicians, basically, and they pull out some bloody thing from the thing. Well, there's going to be a placebo effect. So the people will feel better for a bit, but they were not getting out the cancer or whatever it was that needed doing. And so the people would go away saying, wow, I feel so much better. And then they didn't come back because they were in hospital and dying, whatever. It was really, really horrendous misuse of placebo effects going on there. I expect it still goes on all over the place.
Susan, did you, like, in all of your research, you've just been exposed to so much, the memes, the kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the non-reproducibility. But you also said that there's still something that interests you. Do you think maybe that there's an element of chance involved where, what Jung called synchronicity, where, there's forces that converge or something like that? No,
a chance, yes, but I don't think it's
synchronicity. No,
because I was really fascinated by Jung's synchronicity for a long time, as I was a student, and I really thought there were these kind of supernatural connections between things. It's fun, it's lovely. I'm sure there are people listening who think, of course that's true. Well, fine, you can believe it, but I don't anymore, because I've done a lot of investigation of claims of strange synchronicities. And coincidence is an extraordinary thing. I mean, coincidence in the normal sense, like amazing things happen. They're bound because of the probability in our complex lives. We're bound to come across things that just seem like amazing synchronicities. But I've lost the plot on the beginning of this question.
Well, chance.
No, I mean, the big chance for me, well, was it chance? Who knows what? Something to do with my brain and my genes, I suppose. But having that experience that set me off on this quest in the first place, which I've told you about, has driven my entire life. So when I gave up on the quest for paranormal, I thought, I'm going to prove to the world, I'm going to show all these scientists wrong, I'm going to prove this telepathy. People are still doing that, loads of them. And they're not and I gave up on that. And I thought, well, what really is happening? And I realized that the fundamental mystery is right here in every moment of our life. What is this?
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a classic Zen koan. I mean, it's one of
What is this? Yeah. Manu Bazzano was on a prior conversation. I don't know if you met him. He's an Englander who's also interested in Zen. You'd love him. He quoted that exact koan. What is this?
Well, the Korean Zen tradition, and I know, in particular, I know Stephen Batchelor and his wife Martine Batchelor, who are Korean Zen teachers. They used to live near here, and I know them well. They use only one koan. Their whole life can be, what is this? And that's a fundamental question. I mean, there are plenty of other fundamental koans. Who am I? There's another one. I've done a lot of koan work with those and many other koans. I've written a whole book about koan. I realized that it would be wonderful to, I did a pretty good job, in my own terms, of explaining out-of-body experiences. We now know where in the brain things have to happen to cause an out-of-body experience. Nothing leaves the body. It's a transition of your body schema from where it's meant to be to keep you going to, because it falls apart under certain circumstances, and the brain is grabbing at some kind of schema and making you feel you're somewhere else, looking at whatever's happening from elsewhere. They can be provoked by electrodes in the right temporoparietal junction. Yeah, never mind. It's, we know the neuroscience.
I really like the science. It's a right temporoparietal junction, which is a hotbed for mirror neurons too.
Yep. And it's keeping, we have to have a body schema. Every animal that moves, and maybe plants as well, although that's a bit tricky. But if you're going to move, you've got to know where you are. And if you're going to know where you are, you've got to know where your arms and legs are, or if you're a slug, where your body is, or your snake, whatever. You've got to have a schema, a representation of where your body is, constantly updated. And that's a pretty clever thing for the brain to do, and it can go wrong. So I find that fascinating. But having done that kind of research and written books on near-death experiences and so on, I come back to this fundamental question. What is this? If you really think about the problem, we know so much about the brain now. I mean, there's loads more now. We only know a tiny bit compared to what we could know, but there's all this chemistry going on in here. There's all these signals flying around. There's all this representations and models trying to understand the world and all of that. And what's this? This screen in front of me, or if I look above the screen, the wonderful house plants. I have a load of plants. I do a lot of gardening. I grow lots of food and stuff. I've got these plants there that I can look at. I can look out the window at the field and the tree and the bridge over the river. And, this experience, how does that relate to the stuff we know going on in the brain? This is what fascinates me. And I suspect it will fascinate me till the end of my days. I'll do my best to understand what's going on. But that seems to me to be the real question.
Yeah. And then it's like, what this are we talking about? There's the this that's us, you and I in this conversation. And there's an element of chance, I think, in pairing us together. Sure, I reached out to you, but you're busy, I'm busy, I'm just starting, and you've been established in the field for a long time. And there's an element of chance. I think there's an element of chance with genetic mutation. There's something, and that's what George Hansen is about in the trickster archetype and the paranormal, that there's something in the what is this that is just utterly squirrely. And, just as soon as you try to bring language to it, it's gone. As soon as you try to replicate a conversation, even, it's like, no, you can't replicate the conversation. You can try to code the conversation, then replicate the code.
But knowing that, how do you live?
I'd like to live more and more like how I play with my daughter. Fluidly, ecstatically, playfully.
She's probably better at it than you.
Yeah, she's my teacher. I mean, she's so fluid with how she plays. Like, she can be an alligator, and then 2 seconds later she can be a princess, and then and then back to an alligator, maybe a platypus or a dinosaur or something like that. And it's not like she's playing something. She's actually the thing. She's and it's just very fluid, and there's just so much life in it, and so much vitality. It's very.
When you said that, it reminded me of one of the most horrible experiences that I've ever had. It's awful to go from the lovely play of children, isn't it, to this. I've had ayahuasca quite a few times in the most wonderful setting with an excellent group. But one time I became a snake. It was just the most horrible thing. So I'm like, I can only move like wriggling, and I haven't got any arms and legs. I'm just a kind of tube. It was, I can't really remember it, of course, but it was just horrible. I don't think children like my grandchildren and your daughter, it's like that, but it just reminded me what it means to become some other animal. I know other people with ayahuasca become butterflies and flit around, or they become, deer, and they hop, and then, whatever, they have lovely lives. I end up being a...
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. Yeah, you've bridged us now into the discussion about psychedelics, and it's just like anything that becomes popular, and this is becoming popular now as a pathway and as a methodology. You have kind of like the good, the bad, and the ugly, because there's memes that are now replicating in the psychedelic community, and there's some identity clusterings and stuff like that are kind of cloning.
Well, it might be very new to you, but this has been something through my whole life. I mean, I had my first LSD trip in the early 70s, and mescaline, well, and I have sadly had to spend my life under the war on drugs. We're allowed a bit to do research on these things, and it's fantastic. I was at a wonderful conference in the Netherlands last week, the International Conference on Psychedelic Research, and there's some fabulous research going on. But there have been those of us where someone said to you, "Oh, you're one of the elders." Yeah, those people who did it a long time ago. And then it all became clamped down and impossible and sad. Meanwhile, there are other cultures. The really, really sad thing about it is that there have always been, as far as we know, cultures that have used various psychedelics, and there are many natural occurring psychedelics in plant, and used them well, not abused them the way that so often happens here. Having a culture of use, sometimes with a shaman who's the only one who uses it, sometimes with a shaman who helps everybody else use it, but always in some kind of healing context, some sort of health benefit sort of context. Not healing as in you're ill, I've got to make you better, but healing as in keep you well, keep you together. And now I would hope in my lifetime, but it's getting less and less likely as I get older, that we can have that here. But at the moment, it's still people accused of abusing drugs. It's difficult to find people to help you to take those difficult drugs well. There are people, but it's not, the culture is not full of knowledge of how to use these powerful drugs well. I wish it were.
What do you think psychedelics offer? What do you think psychedelics do to the meme machine?
Lovely question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. Well, sort of break it apart, give it an opportunity to get out of its normal habits and its clinging onto the memeplexes that are so tight, blast them apart, change everything, change space and time so that they haven't got anything to grab onto. And that's why it can be totally terrifying, but can also be a mystical experience of realizing that, you know, all the things you are clinging onto, that you are basically a memeplex, and that can be blown apart. And that's ultimately enlightening if you can go with it and discover that all the things that you'd clung onto that are important to being me actually are just that memes that have accreted around to make who you are, and that some of those can be let go, or they can be taken up and had and let go again, and not be so rigid. Weird things happen, yes. Very, very complicated. And I actually hesitate I shouldn't say any more, because a lot of what I say is it's too tricky to be clear about.
Yeah, one of the neural superhighways that's talked a lot about in the psychedelic community is the default mode network. You know, which must have something to do with memes, because it's like the narrative superhighway. It's like how the brain assembles reality, how it assembles it in narrative structure, autobiographical structure, you know, kind of like mega sequencing, taking the fragmented perceptual world and put it into a canal and assemble a structure. But over time, that can get really kind of crystallized, and, you know, perceptions come in and it's just, you know, a habitual kind of like meme producing mega machine or something like that, where it's just auto producing and psychedelics.
It's very
at least that's,
interesting.
you know.
The discovery of the default mode network has actually been, as you're implying, has become very important, but can be overblown and misunderstood in all kinds of ways. It's not magic, and it's not a very well-defined network, and it's not something that you're ever going to find exactly where it is and so on. But the basic principle of it is that if you are involved in a task like I am now, I mean, I'm trying to listen to your questions, I'm trying to think of useful answers, I'm trying to wonder what you're getting at. I'm using my brain to try and do the best I can in this circumstance. So the default mode network, so I'm using task-oriented networks of various kinds. So there are lots. There's speech stuff going on, and isn't it fascinating? I have no idea what this thing's going to say. It just says it. All that's going on. And I, after the fact, have to notice it. So in concentrating on a task, there's all the, but if, let's say, there was a power cut or something and it all stopped, or you suddenly had to go off and look after your daughter and I'm sat here on my own, then I would sit here and the default network would take over. It's called the default mode network because it's the default that the brain goes back to when it's not required to do It's asked. Excuse me. So what happens then, as you pointed out, all those wretched memes come bubbling up. All those ones that you haven't really dealt with, all those habitual thoughts that you think all the time. Oh, I'm so dreadful and blah, 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 blah. Or, oh, I wish I'd done this. And I said that in this example, let's say, I shouldn't have said that. That was a stupid answer. Oh, why didn't I think of that? I know what he meant by that question, but he didn't really. Oh, I'm not, I didn't get that right. I should try harder and blah, blah. It's all me stuff. And this, and what we were talking schema that relates to out of body experiences, that is that area of default mode network, and that takes over. And at its worst, it leads to rumination and depression, going round and round and round the same old stupid stories that you've gone around a billion times. And so that's why people often want to distract themselves and go and do something else and not be with it. But if you are training and the response to the default mode network is to go, there's that again. Okay. Pay attention. What is it? Look at it. Take a different attitude towards it rather than just kind of going along with the rumination and the wretched selfie stuff, but learn perhaps to be with it.
So if what I do when I in this scenario and I leave for a second and I grab a bite of a peyote button, and so do you, then what might be happening?
You got some. Woo, thank you.
What might be happening? I mean, I've heard of this image. I think it's a good metaphor, like a snow globe effect with psychedelics. I think that's a cool image.
Yeah, shakes things up. And then what? And that's why integration can be so important, because if you have a peyote mescaline experience and things are shaken up, then what happens when the snow settles down again? So it's very interesting that in the traditional cultures that use psychedelics, they don't have this concept of integration. And I think that's probably because they're naturally integrated into the culture of how you deal with these things. But using psychedelics in our ignorant baby beginning kind of culture, we need integration. It can happen naturally. I mean, you can have a peyote trip, let's say, and then for some days afterwards, you will be mulling over, allowing to settle in, allowing the snow to fall and in therapeutic context where people use usually psilocybin, but can be other formal integration sessions where after having the drug and then kind of letting it settle down for a day or two, then they will discuss with the therapist or the counselor, whatever, what happened and try and integrate that into their life. And so I think that the snow dome image is quite helpful in thinking about that.
So out here in California, Susan, there's folks that can trip on a weekend, maybe do a few trips or something like that, learn a little bit of lingo, a little bit of memeage, and then be a shaman.
Oh, don't. Yeah.
Now we have a kind of shaman meme, right? That is now being coded and replicated.
Yep. Well, it always was. If you think about traditional societies, the concept of being the shaman, and it was passed on, imitated, if you like, in a mimetic way from one shaman to have disciples, usually he, not always, disciples who would learn through a long period of training to take over the role and be able to help people and heal them and so on. But now in our fast-moving world, there is not that slow generation to generation handing on the knowledge of the whole society and all the fairly closed societies. I mean, they might have been to other villages and so on, but basically you would know all the people who lived in that situation, and they would know the shaman, and the shaman would be able to work with everybody and and help with difficult reactions and so on. But now in our dispersed, fast-moving society, the idea of becoming a shaman, as you said, in a little while is scary. On the other hand, we need, we cry out for those of us who take psychedelics. We cry out for people who know more than we do and can help us with the difficulties or help us to make the most of these very special experiences. And there are some around, people who are excellent at that. I'm lucky to some, but you get these people who really shouldn't be doing it. And you get ayahuasca tourism. Ayahuasca is so trendy, and you pay a lot of money and you go off into the forest and you might have a really good guide and shaman, but you may have a complete tosser. You don't know what you're going to get.
I ran into this interesting narrative about a medical doctor who is critically minded, who wanted to study shamanic rituals. So he went to some tribe where there was a lead shaman and in the kind of hierarchy there. And he saw what was happening. They were doing like the egg extractions and some of the things that you've mentioned, some of these, kind of theatrical elements. And he was just blown away by the results that he saw. So he ended up joining and getting trained and seeing the results. But then he eventually saw, kind of like you did with parapsychology, he was like, wait, no, I don't buy it. It's not really happening. So it didn't satisfy. So he left and went back to the medical community. And after being in the medical community, he decided that wasn't satisfying either. So he went back to shamanism and embraced the theatrical elements of it and continued to operate. And then so George Hansen, this book that I quoted before, has this really interesting phrase. He says, we need to put the sham back in shamanism.
Brilliant. Yeah, I get it. You need, I think, to be aware that that's what it is. I don't know whether in traditional cultures you need to be aware that's what it is, because you're working with all the knowledge of the people around you. But if you think you are really calling on actual spirits out there who are coming in and doing this stuff, and they really will, take away the cancer or whatever it is, then you're misleading people, and that's not a good idea. Oh, it's all very tricky. It's very, very indeed. I think it's wonderful that these lines of communication are opening up, but there are a lot of dangers along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that's a natural pause. I
was just going to say, I'm beginning to run out of energy. This has been much longer than I thought I would be. Your questions have been so interesting, and I've enjoyed talking to you, but I think it's time for me to go and collapse. I do tend to go to bed very early and sleep a lot. Otherwise, I just can't keep going, So,
Susan, it's just been such an honor having you, and it's been a really rich discussion. I really appreciate you. Thanks.
Well, that's because you've asked some very penetrating questions, and you've kept on pressing the meme stuff, which is great. Thank you for that. I shall ponder some of these ideas as I go sloping off to bed.
All right. Rest well. Take care.
Thank you very much. Great to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Boundless Body with the Somatic Doctor. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and like us on social media.
We're a swarm. We're a colony. We're a multiplicity.
Until next time, be well.